All right, so I'm here with one of our panelists from our seminar discussion where we discussed the role of race and culture in modern American schooling. I thought it'd be nice to sit down one-on-one with Dr. Terence Keel about his new book and get a little more information about the type of work he does. So Dr. Terence Keel is an associate professor of history and black studies at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And his recent book, Divine Variations, available now through Stanford University Press, traces the roots of modern racial science to Christian intellectual history and ideology. Dr. Keel is an affiliate of the Center for the Study of Racism, Social Justice, and Health, and was co-editor of a fall 2017 special issue of the American Journal of Law and Medicine that explored how critical race theory can transform the study of health inequalities across the health sciences. Dr. Keel received his PhD from Harvard University and joins us here on All of the Above to help us explore the role of race and culture and science and religion in modern schooling. So thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, man.
So first of all, tell us about this new book.
So the book is an attempt to tell the story of where our ideas about race come from within science. And so what I'm trying to do is think of this story in a new way. There's lots of great material that have been written about ideas about race coming out of the Enlightenment, which is at a period sort of in the 18th century, and then we in America inherit those ideas and reproduce them. And there are parts of that story that are right, to say that the emergence of the sciences during that time really gave us our ideas around why we vary, what our differences, and where they come from. But what I'm actually trying to do in the book is to say that our ideas about science and our ideas about race are connected to what we believe about religion. In other words, I'm trying to tell a story that explains that our ideas about race have a connection to, specifically in the West, Christian intellectual history. And what I mean by that is Christianity is a religion and it's a practice, it's a set of beliefs, but it's also a tradition of ideas. It's a tradition that involves arguments about racial difference. It's a tradition that includes beliefs about what makes someone Christian and what makes someone not Christian. And that this tradition has been passed along through time in the West that has come to influence the way scientists think about human difference and variation. And I'm trying to kind of unpack that story to give us a new view about what it means to believe at a scientific level that we are all different, but specifically different at the level of race.
So I remember being in science class as a high schooler and teachers teaching us the scientific method and impressing upon us this idea that science is totally objective, totally secular, not influenced by any religion or people's own cultural biases or whatever they might be bringing to the table. So explain to us a little bit more about how your work connecting modern Western science to Christian ideology, how that might influence the type of science education students in the U.S. are getting or should be getting.
Sure. Now, I think your experience is a common experience for most of us in high school, thinking about what science is. And in many ways, this idea that science is somehow objective, it's value-free, it's democratic, reflects certain beliefs around science that really kind of come onto the scene at the end of the 19th century when evolutionary biologists begin to sort of fundamentally shape the practice of science in the United States and in Europe. And you begin to see the professionalization of scientific fields, and you get a diversity of different specializations, and you get the publication of academic journals for the first time. You get academic institutions that are now teaching people to become professional scientists. And some of these institutions, like Cornell University, for example, was one of the first universities in America that did not require its faculty or its presidents to have any kind of religious commitment. And it was a university founded under the belief that it wanted to be a freestanding space for scientific inquiry. In many ways, there are some positive things about that story. There's this belief that somehow science embodies for America and for Europe as well the best of our progressive democratic values, the idea that we believe in rationality, that we can be persuaded based upon evidence and argumentation, which surely is something that's lacking in our current political and social climate where truth just seems to be an illusion. There's an idea that science somehow allows us to bring out the better parts of ourselves. I think in telling that story and the myth that was circulated around that story also, I think for some problematic reasons, required that we exclude the influence of religion and belief from science. we have in many ways inherited a vision of science that's pure, that is somehow not cultural, that's not social, that is a freestanding form of looking at the world. And I think that is at our detriment. I think that what a lot of research in the field of the history of science and in what we now call science studies for the last 2 decades have shown us is that science is a cultural practice, which is to say human beings practice science, and when they step into the lab or they analyze data, they bring their beliefs, they bring their ideologies with them. And this is true across all of the sciences. I think in the case of the history of scientific racism, or the study of human racial differences, you can certainly see how cultural influences, and specifically religious influences, shape the way that scientists think about racial difference. One just quick example, we might ask the question, or many of us are really familiar with the idea that we all share a common ancestor, right, that humans are somehow all fundamentally African. This is a kind of popular cultural term that we throw around. Well, why is it that we in the West, and particularly those of us who come from cultures that share Christian beliefs, have this idea, this commitment to thinking that we all share a common ancestor, right? If you really ask that question and you interrogate where does the idea of humans share a common ancestor come from, you inevitably run into Christianity, and you run into a set of biblical ideas and a set of rational ideas that support this claim that all humans are either created in the image of God or share a common ancestor through Adam. And what happens in the history of science is that this idea gets taken out of its religious context and then is used within the field of scientific research and becomes normalized, which is to say it becomes an unthinking assumption that scientists reproduce in their research. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that the idea that we share an ancestor, common ancestor, should be done away with. I think there are some very positive reasons to hold that idea into play, but I also want us to have a view of science to recognize that science ought to be questioned and criticized, and that it's healthy for us to have a kind of suspicion for where our scientific commitments come from. Why do we ask the questions that we do? Why do we continue to reproduce research that says that humans vary genetically when, since the 1950s, with the sort of advance of modern genetic science, we realize that we share more in common than we have differences between the two of us. And we also know that since scientists can sequence our genome and look at all of our genetic differences, we have so much more in common than we could have ever imagined. We're 99.98% the same, which is to say there's a tremendous amount of genetic similarity between us, so much so that it's almost illogical to talk about race. Yet and still, you can look at the popular news and press and find a news story drawing some association between your genetic ancestry to Africa being tied to your risk for disease or your behavior, etc. So this is the persistent idea. We have a persistent commitment to thinking in racial terms, and I believe religion has something to do with it.
Wow. All right. So let me first ask then, based on if, as a traditional like K-12 teacher who has not really been exposed to any recent research in science, I'm a history teacher. All that you said right there leads me to question, for example, if I'm a biology teacher, am I in need of totally rethinking and reshifting my view of science and what I do? What should our viewers who might be current science teachers or, maybe elementary teachers who have science units that they do, what should any of them take away from what you just said? Or what are some beginning starter steps for them to sort of understand what you're saying here?
I think it's a really great question. It's, on the one hand, again, going back to what I was mentioning earlier about science for us in the West, and particularly in the United States, seems to embody these democratic, progressive, liberal values. Mm-hmm. And if you think about what a high school educator does, their job, among many other things, is to prepare the next generation of citizens. In some ways, as I understand it, high school biology and high school science socializes students to respect argumentation and empiricism and methodological analysis, to be able to suspend our judgments until we have enough evidence to make a claim. I think these are all valuable and important traits and attributes that we should be shaping our students with. At the same time, however, we need to be mindful of the fact that science has a history, that it's shaped by our culture, and I think we can tell our students both of these stories. We can say to them, science embodies the best of potentially democratic values, but at the same time, what's great about American democracy is that it's something that involves revision and involves critiquing our inherited assumptions and involves changing what we believe. And I think that this is true surely for science. So in other words, I remember surely being a high schooler learning science and feeling somewhat, in some ways, burdened by the kind of the truth of science, the fact that it was unquestionable and that fact and data sort of was this thing that somehow lorded over top of us. And I think a lot of students carry that feeling with them into the classroom at the collegiate level. I think we need to do away with that a little bit, because often I think people feel disempowered when they read a story that says, hey, if you're Latino, you're more likely to have type 2 diabetes if you have a specific genetic marker. And I think that is a very disempowering thing to read if you don't have the tools to say first, well, let me question the validity of that research and that story. Right. And I think that's the work that I would hope at the high school level can be implemented somewhere in the classroom. Getting our students to, if they can be critical about history and they can be critical about laws and sociology, they can surely be critical about science. And I think we can teach our high schoolers that.
All right, so, well, then let me ask you a personal question then. So one of my family members recently submitted a DNA sample to, I believe it was 23andMe. It might have been one of the other companies. You mentioned earlier, and you mentioned a little bit in your book, the advances in DNA technology and advances in our study of genealogy has led to sort of a popularization of people submitting DNA samples and getting back a report. Mm-hmm. In our report, well, his report, but you know, him being my brother, our report showed a lot of things that we did anticipate. So, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, my mixed race, and my mother's from Spain, and there's some Iberian. But we always heard that our family had quite a bit of Jewish, that our mother's side of the family had quite a bit of Jewish in there. We didn't see any indications of Hebrew ancestry, nothing, nowhere in there was anything about Jewish. So what's that mean?
Well, that's what's interesting about the consumer market for genetic testing technology is that, on the one hand, I think it fills a need that's very uniquely American to, and particularly I think for Americans of color, to tell the story of where their ancestors come from in the old world, which is to say, in the continents before arriving in the United States. I think for African Americans, where a lot of the traditions and practices were in some ways broken, the genealogical line in Africa is very difficult to recover. The genetic tests do a great job of trying to fill those gaps. And I think we should take this, to build on the point that I was making earlier, these technologies with a little bit of grain of salt, to realize that they only give us a half of the story or a small snapshot of the story. Those social histories that we carry, those stories that our family members share with us, they are still true and meaningful, even if they don't appear within the actual genetic testing sample. And one way to think about this, to think again about being critical of science, if we really look at the way these commercial ancestry testing companies work, they essentially have within their database a large sample of genetic variants, which is to say traits that differentiate people who are from Europe, from Asia, from Africa. And they create a catalog of these traits. And then the way they get that catalog is by sampling people around the world. So they go to West Africa, they go to Europe, they go to Asia, they go to Australia, they do a little DNA sample, and they put it into their database, right? And then if you come in and you give your genetic information to those companies, they take your information and compare it to the data set that they have in their laboratory.
Okay.
Now, the real interesting thing about that, though, I think the social, cultural thing about that is, well, what happens if you have ancestry that isn't represented in their data set? Perhaps because they didn't sample a portion of the world, or the portion of the world that they did sample, the person, the individual or groups that they sampled may not have carried the genetic marker that your family has. So that would sometimes be absent in their data set. So you may get readings that are actually tell you more about the data set that that particular testing company has than necessarily what's in your genome. Wow. But this is the kind of thing that, again, getting to my point, many of these DNA testing companies, they actually disclose some of this information. It's in the sort of the underwriting and many of their literature on what they're doing. But if we don't have a citizenry that's sort of socialized to question these assumptions, they may get these readings and believe them to be sort of factually true at even the expense of their own personal social histories, right, for example. So they're very much may be Jewish ancestry in your family line that just didn't show up in the genetic database of that particular company you use to sort of get the readout.
Interesting. So, have you tried out one of these
I have.
companies, or
So,
you,
well, that's an interesting question. So, I very long time ago bought a genetic test. At the time, I was really interested in thinking about. Well, in 2010, geneticists figured out that humans actually had children with Neanderthals. Now, Neanderthals are an extinct human population that basically disappeared somewhere between 30 to 50,000 years ago. And we thought that when humans migrated out of Africa, we completely sort of absorbed or eliminated them, and there was no evidence that we actually had children. Well, it turns out actually that people from Europe and Asia have up to 4% Neanderthal DNA. Well, what that means is that somewhere around 30 to 50,000 years ago, as a wave, one of the waves of humans leaving Africa made their way into the Middle East, they encountered the Neanderthal population, which had left Africa about 250,000 years earlier. And that population was throughout Europe, as far as sort of Portugal and as far east as Siberia. They occupied that land for a really long time. And they were also moving their way down in the direction of the Middle East. So when humans interacted with them, they were still genetically compatible enough to have children, and so they reproduced. That genetic legacy is still in our DNA. Now, what's interesting, though, is that geneticists, when they did this study, they assumed initially that this genetic marker was only in people from Europe and Asia. Apparently, it was almost absent from people in sub-Saharan Africa, and surely not present in West Africa. So it had this idea that if you had African ancestry, you didn't have any Neanderthal DNA. But the problem with thinking like that is it forgets, I think, the most important part of human history, which is that humans are constantly migrating and they're constantly sharing DNA with each other by having children. That is the constant component of all human evolutionary history. So what that means is that it is entirely possible and likely that West Africans might have encountered the humans who maybe returned back from the Middle East with that Neanderthal sample and brought it and mixed it back into their DNA. Not to mention the fact that after the 15th century with the transatlantic slave trade, Africans were displaced all throughout North and South America and mixed with Europeans, which is to say that they would have gotten that Neanderthal DNA in their genome if there's someone in their ancestry who has European ancestor or relative. So I, as an African American who has family from Louisiana, which our family have always understood themselves in Louisiana as French Creole, which is to say they have a little bit of African, probably from Senegal. They've got surely some French. My grandfather spoke French fluently, but they have some Native American and possibly some Spanish as well. So if they have a little bit of Spanish and a little bit of French, they surely have Neanderthal.
Right.
So I wanted to get that test to see if I had any Neanderthal DNA in me. I didn't do it in large part because many of my colleagues who look at sort of the bioethical questions and the ways that many of these genetic testing companies, particularly the popular ones, they will get your DNA, but you sign a consent form that essentially says that they are allowed to sell your information to third parties or to use it in research and design projects that may have nothing to do with your consent. You essentially sign away your DNA. Right? That's a problem. Not to mention the fact that it's increasingly clear that cyber threats are real. So the idea that someone could maybe sequence your DNA, or you could have your DNA sequenced at a testing company, and then someone could hack that company and expose what your genetic profile is, and in the process reveal that you might have Alzheimer's or you might have some kind of debilitating disease. These are real sort of like security issues, and we live in a climate where people don't have health insurance, where people can be excluded with pre-existing conditions. So there's a kind of a risk out there to get your DNA sampled and potentially have your information available to the public in the some near future. So those are the reasons that I put a break on getting my own DNA sample. Now, am I curious? Of course, I'm interested and curious, and it would be interesting for the sake of just sort of fun and kind of a social narrative to figure out what is in my ancestry. But of course, with the caveat that I understand that this is only a portion of who I am as an individual, right? These tests don't tell me everything about where I come from.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And Divine Variations, we'll post a link to the Stanford University Press website for those of you interested in learning more about the roots behind modern Western science.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
sir.
a lot.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, man.